quick and completely free. So over to Rafael and to...
Right, I'm going to stand up so you can see me. I hope you can all hear me. Great. Oh, I'm trying to speak loud. If I lose my voice, I'm sorry. First of all, thank you very, very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in, I suppose, what we should call the resistance. It sort of feels like Carmel's house. Now, I was invited to speak for half an hour, which is quite a long time, even for me to hear the sound of my own voice. There's a lot to say. I'm obviously going to leave loads of things out. It's very hard to know. I suspect I'm in quite well-informed company here, and there are a lot of the technical things people will know, but it's possible that I'll either be too broad brush or go in too deep. If there's something that I say and it's absolute gibberish, do please shout out, what are you talking about? Or likewise, if it all sounds far too familiar, say, yes, we know all that, move on. I really don't mind much. Also, there's lots of us, it's a warm room. If anyone actually feels the need to go to the bar while I'm speaking, I won't be offended. If you're standing up to leave because you're appalled by something I've said, like throw something or make it clear that you're offended by what I've said. Otherwise, I'll just presume you're going for a drink, and then I won't know that you're offended. Well, what I want to do is start. Really, I want to go way back in time, just briefly, as briefly as I can, to talk about some of the roots of how we've ended up where we are. I want to talk about where we are, obviously where we're going, what happens next. These are really the big questions. Where we are, well, we are leaving the European Union. Are we leaving the European Union? This is the one question I know everyone's going to want to ask. It's like, actually, what's going to happen? So let me get that one out of the way first. I don't know. Right? I just want to do, there's going to be a couple of charts involved in this. I mean, this is the first one. Anyone who says they know for sure is lying, or we just clearly, the lesson of the last 2 years in politics is all sorts of crazy things can happen. What I would say, let's do this one first, right? So this was about 2016, and we're going to do, this is like balance of probabilities, right? So sorry, it gets a bit mathsy here. So let's say probability 0, 1, roughly, yeah? And this is soft, hard, on this spectrum here. So this right here is membership of the European Union, and this is Jacob Rees-Mogg, beyond, off the charts, When the vote was made, in 2016, June 2016, my instinct was, I haven't thought this through, have you? This is going to be really hard, but there's a lot of pressure to do it. And therefore, the likelihood of, in a negotiation, having to negotiate your way back into so much, really, realistically, while having to deliver something called Brexit, the balance of probabilities kind of looked a little bit sort of like that sort of thing. Yeah? So probably a soft, really soft Brexit. No one would be mad enough to do that. Right. That's 2016. Same chart. Here we are, 2018. 0-1, soft, hard. Now, I think, because for the same reason it's so hard, there is actually a discernible possibility that enough people will recognise that it just can't be done. So you've actually, this bit has grown. But then the realistic, the problems of actually trying to negotiate something that's not that is so difficult that now it looks much more like that. So that is, that's my broad outline of where we are. And we can talk a little bit more about the detail of how we come to that. But first, I want to just, because, as you know, what we've got the council next week. In theory, it has to be a bit of a deal, proto-deal. Emergency summit probably then in November. Then a meaningful vote, which is actually more than one meaningful vote, and we can talk about actually what that means literally and how that will break down and the numbers of that a bit later. But I do think it's, and I don't know if you read, I wrote a piece earlier this week just about how extraordinary it is that we've come so far in this discussion, and things have changed so much, that it's easy to forget that 10 years ago, the idea that the UK would leave the European Union was the most fringe position, and it was kind of political halitosis. It was not something that that anyone who wanted to be elected would really talk about to an electorate or to a group of people who considered themselves part of the political mainstream. There were about 12 Tory MPs who who were explicitly said, we think, part of the better off out group, they were called, who thought you should leave the European Union. Two of them, a few years, 5, 6 years after that, joined UKIP. And even then, even in 2015, David Cameron won a majority with a manifesto essentially committing to stay in the single market. And not a single one of the ministers currently serving in Theresa May's government, that's current cabinet ministers and even lower ministers, not a single one of them in that 2015 said, hang on a second, no, we think we should leave the single market. So something quite extraordinary has happened. So how did we get here, right? I'll try and rattle through this relatively quickly. Now, I'm not looking at my phone to see what people say about it on Twitter. I'm looking just to keep an eye on the time. Which I forgot to start. Okay, so now it starts again. So you're in for a longer talk than you thought you were. Now you could go back really far. You could do people talk about the Reformation. You could talk about the Armada. I'm not that interested in that. I think, in terms of sort of living cultural memory or recent memory, I think that the very significant cultural moment from which you can start to track where British, English Euroscepticism, that's an interesting question, how much of it is really English. It starts in 1941, the standing alone against fascism, and how that embeds itself into a national idea of a country that is, in a very, very profound sense, its greatest ever achievement, the thing that casts a shadow across history for generations, is done as a solo island against the rest of the continent. You then have a situation after the war where, because of Marshall Plan money and because of the strategic alignments in the Cold War and the need for the Americans to shore up Western Europe, largely with a lot of capital and investment, you very quickly come to a situation, I'm skirting through a lot of history here, haven't even, let's just park Suez for a moment. You very quickly get to a situation where the British self-image, as empire declines, is still pretty much a superpower, right? Empire is feeling a bit like shabby around the corners, but a bit dog-eared here and there, but we're on the wall. And then you're looking across at continental Europe, and they're developing this project, and meanwhile British officials are going over to Europe essentially to observe the development of this project, actually kind of to ruin it. Explicitly instructed really to sort of sabotage it, or at least damp it down, thinking of level work. And yet, gradually, by the time you reach the late 1960s, something strange is happening, which is West Germany is doing very well, France is starting to do quite well, even Italy is picking up, and you get this sense in the UK and Britain that, hang on, what's happening? Why are we not still this great country that we were? This famous line about having lost an empire but not yet found a role. Meanwhile, all these continentals seem to be making quite good cars and fridges. That's not on. And so by the time you get to sort of the early 1970s, and again we've skipped out a load of the first veto, de Gaulle and all that stuff, but there's a lot to get through. By the time you get to the early 1970s, big picture, the decision that the UK makes to actually join what was then the EEC is not a heroic, happy one. It is one that comes from a sense of humility, of reduced status. There's an element of kind of shame and embarrassment baked into it. Now that's completely different from the way that a lot of other European nations see themselves, see their part of the European project. So they tell the story of their participation in the European project. If it's Germany's case, a lot of it is about atonement. If it's other countries, it's about putting aside war and build. It's a peace project, right? That simply was never really the English conception, the British English conception of it. And I think this is fantastically important. It's fantastically important because it buries deep in, sort of sows into the soil of British national mythology, British national identity, an idea that we really oughtn't to have had to do that, but we did. And therefore, buried in that process is this sense of, wouldn't it be fantastic if we did not need that? If we could once again re-find that way, that the dream of being, in quotes, independent from that project. Also, tremendously important in this respect, this also, in a different way, afflicts the left, and I'll tell you why, because what we're talking about really there is a conservative and nationalist conception. There's a very, very important moment, you probably know about it. In 1988, Jacques Delors, President of the European Commission, addresses the Trade Union Congress. And what he basically says to the left and to trade unions is, you have lost, you have been defeated in your own borders. This Thatcher project is going to strip away your labour protections, and the left has been crushed. Socialism, social democracy has been crushed in this country, but it lives over there in Europe. And actually, this thing that you have thought of, that the left has thought of with suspicion, the single market, the European Union. Remember, Labour were more divided in 1973 than the Conservatives. The current leader of the Labour Party, who we will come to, was very much of the Benite Eurosceptic view, because he saw it as essentially a capitalist business rich men's club. And Delors says, no, it's not that. This is your way, this is your last way to build a fence around workers' rights, in protection from the forces of Thatcherism and what's associated with it. And so, that essentially, from then on, really pretty much the Labour Party in this country became very pro-European. But also, again, built into it that sense of defeat and humiliation, and we're having to rely on them, and wouldn't it be great if we didn't need to rely on them, these continentals, to protect our rights. So what you have is a situation where we're now going to, let's fast forward right back into the 21st century. Throughout that long period, when the UK was a member of the European Union, or EEC becomes EU, and it grows, and we get more and more embedded in this project, and it's accepted as axiomatic that this is something that's necessary, important for the UK economy. Obviously it is, self-evidently it is. It coincides with an enormous period of growth and prosperity, as well as much better food and coffee and all the other things that we like, frankly. But the people who might have been defending or standing up and saying, this is a brilliant thing, wow, check out this awesome thing we've done, never used those muscles. They were always apologising for it, they were feeling defensive about it, and even pro-Europeans had that slight cringy sense of shame about it, I think. And as a result, the muscle that isn't used wastes away. And so by the time you get to the period where it's really under threat, we hadn't even articulated for ourselves the arguments, or practiced. We didn't know what it sounded like in our own ears to say this is a wonderful thing that has been great for our country, because that stuff takes practice. Now, before I get up to the present day, there's just two very important general elections that I want to mention in terms of then the cultural process that gets us out of the European Union. One is 2005 general election. No one cares about the 2005 general election. It was a crap election. It was the one that everyone lost. It's not big in the history books, but it was very important for a reason. I don't know if you remember, that Michael Howard was leader of the Conservative Party then, and he ran this quite nasty campaign. It was perceived, the slogan was, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" It's like, and they'd have some saying, "It's not racist to worry about immigration. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Right? Interestingly, that was the first campaign in the UK that brought Linton Crosby to our shores. That was his campaign, and it was not tremendously successful to the extent that Tony Blair won a third term. And what was the very important lesson that British politics, that most British politicians took from that 2005 election? It was that there was no future for that kind of Michael Howard, are you thinking what I'm thinking, angry, reactionary, nasty party, bit nationalistic, probably maybe a little bit racist around the edges, sort of politics that the Conservatives have been sort of flirting with for a long time. They're sort of what we think of as these sort of angry, red-faced, sort of egg-on ties with like, all that. Yeah, it's not. And it says just for the purpose of the camera, it's the horrible, unfair caricature that I've just described, but it was the caricature of the time, and there was a perception that was absolutely for the past because they tried it and it had failed. And Labour took that, and lots of people took that thought, like, this is basically now a liberal modern country. Right, the Conservatives understood that. They made David Cameron their leader. The whole modernisation project was, he said, stop banging on about Europe. All that stuff, all that, what was, UK, a bunch of loonies, fruitcakes, closet racists, he said. Just get rid of that stuff. Right, but, yes, Labour won that election. But actually, the Conservatives won the popular vote in England in that election. The Tories did quite well in that election. And I think a lot of people fail to understand that to read in that process what was building around the country, in a sense of feeling exactly spoken to by that Michael Howard campaign. A very strong sense of there's a kind of metropolitan liberal elite, and they sneer at us and they laugh at us, but we are cross about immigration, and we do feel that actually this country has changed too much, and we don't like it. And so then what happens, you get to 2010, David Cameron becomes Prime Minister, and the Conservatives have sat through 13 years of Labour government, and what they want is redress. What they want is say, like, at last, God, Labour government, now we're going to have a proper Conservative government. Again, people who had their political education in the 1980s, thought of Tory government as essentially the natural state of things, and really had sort of got used to Tony Blair, but were very, very relieved that whole business was over. And instead of getting proper Conservative government, they got Nick Clegg as Deputy Prime Minister. And they got Cameron, who, with his sort of metropolitan modernisation project, the windmill on the house, the hugging the huskies and the hoodies and all stuff. If again, I'd like to say, it feels like such a long time ago, doesn't it? But it really wasn't that long ago, and it wasn't that long ago that absolutely everyone in politics presumed that, beyond a certain fringe, that was because the political mainstream, probably in perpetuity, was in that sort of space, the space that Cameron was trying to occupy. Now, I think, and don't worry, we are coming closer, with some focusing in, zeroing in on the moment we're in now. It makes sense to think of that coalition government as actually a coalition of three parties, really, or three factions. There's the Lib Dems, who were desperate to show that they could be serious in government, so they never rebelled. They were the most ridiculously, preposterously loyal. I mean, I know Lewis has been a Lib Dem seat, and there might be Liberal Democrats in the room, but looking back, there were some terrible, terrible mistakes made in that period. There were the Tory modernisers, the sort of Cameroons, and then there were the sort of the Tory right and the reactionaries. And what you saw for that very, very important process was the reactionaries feeling so excluded from their own governments and so aggrieved they didn't have a true Conservative government that they started this process of ratcheting David Cameron, threatening constantly, essentially the prospect of a kind of split in Conservatism, to drag him and the party ever in a rightward direction, but particularly in a Eurosceptic direction. It's worth bearing in mind that even to win the Conservative Party leadership, he had to make a pledge to take the Tories out of the EPP, the European People's Party, in the European Parliament. I can happily go into a lot of detail about that, but that if anyone's interested in the details of that, it's fascinating, but we won't go into that now. And what you saw in that period, that very, very important period, 2010 to 2015, was Euroscepticism being bundled up together with a kind of a reactionary culture war against the whole of the sort of liberal mainstream proposition that since 2005 everyone had very smugly and complacently thought was the normal middle ground of British politics. There's a very interesting point that was made to me by a Conservative MP, a Leaver, not that long ago, who said, go back to the Bloomberg speech that Cameron did in 2013, the one where he first promised a referendum. And what was going on there? Why was it that in 2013, David Cameron goes, right, what we definitely need to do is have a referendum on membership of the European Union. Again, looking back, it was a weird thing to do. It was all, politics then mostly was all about the deficit and austerity and trying to beat up Ed Miliband, and benefit cuts. It was a completely different frame of politics. And suddenly David Cameron was like, no, but also referendum on the European Union. Why? Right? It wasn't Euroscepticism. This Tory MP pointed out to me. He was absolutely right. He said, it was gay marriage. That's what was actually happening. That was the hottest point for Tory MPs at that moment, was they were going back to their constituencies, going back to their associations, going to church, and having their own people come up and prod them in the chest and go, why are you voting for this awful gay marriage thing? Now, and people saying, I'm leaving UKIP, and a lot of the organisers, a lot of grassroots Conservatives going off to UKIP. Yes, obviously it was, in the background was all this Eurosceptic stuff, but it was a whole sort of like a giant dyspeptic burp of illiberal reaction from people who've been forced to swallow a load of liberalism and progressive politics over a really long period of time. And it came out partly in the expression of Euroscepticism. Now, what were the defining features, therefore, of David Cameron? And now we're going to get to 2016. Right. Well, what are the defining features of David Cameron as a politician that can be said in polite company? Intellectual complacency, a tremendous sort of confidence, blithe confidence in a sort of capacity that his own sort of essay crisis wits will get him throughout any scrape at all. And believe that in a campaign situation, when he turns on the charm, it works. Now this was two very important episodes significant for this. One is the Scottish referendum in 2014, from which David Cameron and his team learned that economic fear trumps national identity politics, or at least they think that's what they learn. And then the 2015 general election, where Cameron learns that David Cameron can basically win an election a lot of people thought he couldn't win. And so he goes into the 2016 referendum with those two beliefs absolutely firmly rooted in his mind. So much so that he thinks that in the sort of spring of that year, before the campaign had really heated up, Conservative MPs told me that the briefings they were getting from George Osborne were, we're going to win it and it's not even going to be close because basically people vote with their wallets. Be with us because you don't want to be with the losers. I'm pretty sure that's one of the significant reasons. Certainly that would have been a factor encouraging Boris Johnson to vote Leave, to leave the Leave campaign. He thought it was very possible they wouldn't win, but he would then be well positioned to lead the angry, just denied faction. And it was all a bit of an accident they won. That to me seems a very plausible interpretation of what Boris Johnson did in that situation. Now, we're all going to have our own interpretations of what went wrong in that referendum campaign. Again, which we can come back to, and it can involve the press, which I haven't even talked about. It can involve the Russians, if you like, which I can talk about. But for the time being, I just want to focus on which to get to where we are now, very, very important feature of why the Leave campaign won, apart from the Russians and the rest of it, and why they actually won, because they actually won. 17.4 to 16.1 million, that's actually a lot of people, right? And it's a lot of people, crucially, who had never voted before. The leader of Britain Stronger in Europe said to me on the day after the referendum, he said, I knew something had gone very, very wrong when I visited the polling booth, and we had people turning up, literally obviously never been through this process in their lives before, saying, where do I vote for the Leave? Where's the Leave? You know, how does this work? And you have to say, can I do that? No, you go into the booth and you put the cross. Literally a lot of people, you know, and they were angry, and a lot of them were in Labour constituencies. They weren't necessarily the Labour voters in Labour constituencies. That's a little nuance again that we can come to, but they were in Labour constituencies. And so the sense that this was a national electoral moment, an expression of something hitherto unseen, certainly in recent electoral history when turnout has been falling, in England at least, is culturally enormously significant in terms of how people then responded immediately afterwards in terms of what needed to be done to enact this referendum, the mandate, what the mandate meant. And crucially, it was absolutely vital for the way that Theresa May interpreted it. Now, just a little aside here, I'm very confident that when the history of this period is written, there will be head-scratching, bafflement, I don't know what, it'll be a whole subset of historical examination will be how on earth did it come to pass that something that is very obviously a revolutionary act, upturning the fundamental premises on which British government and economics and trade and diplomacy had been conducted for a generation. How on earth did it come to pass that was taken through and enacted by a Prime Minister who had not supported it before in the referendum? It's actually insane. Again, we sort of presume that, because Boris Johnson got stabbed in the back of Michael Gove and Andrew Leadsom, no way, and therefore obviously Theresa May, right? But no, what she did, she was a Remainer. They know it, we know it. It's actually very, very weird. And the reason this is significant is because she then, in the autumn of 2016, makes a very, very important decision in a speech that she cooks up together with her one advisor, Nick Timothy, the one who looks a bit like Solzhenitsyn. And she understood, she interpreted the referendum. First of all, she felt she needed to scrub the remain off her body, the stain of the body. Very, very important. And so she did a very interesting thing. interesting, the words do a heavy lifting in that sentence, she took the culture war interpretation of the referendum result, and she said, obviously, we need to give redress to these angry people. That means you need to have immigration control is absolutely paramount. And we need to leave the single market, and we can't possibly have any European Court of Justice jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that was a big decision. Now,